In today's show, it's season preview time. Anfernee Simons got paid this summer. Is he ready to take that big old leap? Welcome to Locked On Blazers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Trailblazers, your daily Portland Trailblazers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What up, world? It's your past first point guard and Trailblazers reporter, Mike Richmond. You're listening to another episode of Locked On Blazers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get podcasts, and now also on YouTube. We've been on YouTube for a while, but we're on YouTube now. Check us out there as well as wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for making the show your first listen every day. 3 days a week, all through the first couple weeks of September. We're going to be back at 5 days a week once the Blazers open up training camp. So whenever we got a new episode, make it your first listen every day. Today's episode is the first installment of the Locked On Blazers season previews. We're dedicating a full episode to every player on the roster and giving you a brief but thorough look at what they'll bring to the Trailblazers. We've done this for 3 years. I've done this for about 3 years now. I think it's a good way to sort of get ready for the season. They work as sort of just capsules of our expectations in this moment of time, and we can revisit them at the end of the year to see what we got right and what we didn't. Here's how we'll do it. We'll look at how each player performed last season, if when necessary, how they wound up on the Blazers. We'll talk best case and worst case scenarios for the upcoming year, and then we'll finish the episodes with a discussion of likely role and how we expect that player to perform in the 2022-2023 season with your beloved Portland Pinwheels. That's your Trailblazers. This is the first installment of the countdown to training camp. So if you're listening back to this one, there are more coming as we'll roll out the rest of them over the next month. So be sure you check it out. Today, we're talking everyone's favorite fifth-year guard, Anfernee Simons. So let's get into it with a recap of how his 2021-22 season went. It was Ant's fourth season, and it was unquestionably his best. He finished with averages of 17.3 points, 2.6 boards, 3.9 assists, with slash lines of 44% from the field, 40% from three, and 88% from the free throw line. His season, though, is best appreciated as broken into two distinct parts. It's before and after the new year. The calendar year was really kind to Anfernee Simons. When it flipped 2022, he flipped the switch. But prior to that, the first 29 games from opening night in October until December 31st, Anfernee Simons was a backup. He was behind C.J. McCollum. He was behind Norman Powell. He was behind in a crowded backcourt situation. He averaged 11.9 points, 2.6 boards, and 2.2 assists, shot 42% from the floor and 37% from three on just over 5 attempts per game. His still majority of his shots were coming from deep, but he wasn't a high-volume guy. Things done changed. Damian Lillard was done for the season done for the season on December 31st. So that means beginning on January 1st, the Blazers were without Damian Lillard, and the keys kind of got turned over to Anfernee Simons. There were, also C.J. McCollum was missing time with an injury and then awaiting the birth of his child. Norman Powell missed a handful of games in there too. So it was Ant's show, and it started with a hurry. And it started hot. January 3rd, a career-high 43 points, out-dueling Trae Young and the Atlanta Hawks in Portland. In that same week, 38 against Miami, 31-6 against Sacramento, 23-11 against Brooklyn, 31-11 at Washington. Over the final 27 games, Anfernee Simons averaged 23.4 points and 5.8 assists. And he shot better from the floor and better from three as he became a high-volume shooter. 45% from the floor, 42% from three on 10 attempts per game. He had 11 games of at least 25 points, 7 games of at least 30. And after he had 38 points at Minnesota on March 5th, Simons' season officially ended. He was diagnosed, identified, or more accurately shut down with what the team called mild patellar tendinopathy. He had tendonitis in his left kneecap, or he was just too darn good for the Blazers to accomplish their goals, and so they had to get him up out of there. They had to sit Anfernee Simons down. He doesn't play in the final 23 games of the season. he was too good to have on the court. He had gone from being having the worst shooting months of his career in December, worst shooting months of the last 2 seasons in December, to being one of the best guards in the league in January. He was just fantastic. And for 6 weeks, averaging 24-5, 24-6 basically for 6 weeks, is real deal production. The Blazers weren't particularly lighting the world on fire. They were slightly below 500 over those 6 weeks, but the roster wasn't very good. And Anfernee Simons showed that he can step into a larger role and be something. He went from a guy who had promise, who was taking on bit roles, to a guy when given the keys, when given the role, he took such a massive step forward. The playmaking jump was obvious. The shooting scaled up. He continued to, he had a much higher usage, much higher responsibility, and he remained a very, very efficient, even straight up percentage-wise, a straight up better shooter. Some of that was just like an ice cold December while dealing with some family stuff. He wasn't as good. He was having things off the court were affecting him. I think he kind of was able to find some peace after his grandfather passed, and he got to be with him. And part of that peace translated in some ways, and Anfernee Simons admitted as much, to him playing just the best basketball of his career. The question isn't sort of what if Ant can get back there. The question is, can Ant in another situation duplicate something similar? Because getting back there would imply that he's the lead guard on this team. That's not going to be his role. So what I want to talk about in the second segment is the best case and worst case scenarios, understanding sort of where Anfernee Simons fits into the puzzle, because the best case scenario is different than what his role will be or was in January. And the worst case scenario, I think, has changed a little bit because we've seen how good Ant can be. Let's do that in the second segment, talk best case and worst case scenarios for Anfernee Simons. But first, let me tell you about Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar in the market, the best tasting protein bar that there is. If you're a longtime listener to the show, you've been hearing me tell you about Built Bars for 3+ years. I love them. The pack a punch. On average, 17 grams of protein, 140 calories, just 5 net carbs or fewer in every bar. Plus, great flavors, covered in 100% chocolate. They got a whole line of puff flavors for the marshmallow fans out there. Or if you're like me, you love peanut butter brownie, peanut butter and chocolate, plus 17 grams of protein. Packing a punch, tastes great and good for you. Go get yourself some. Go to Built.com and use the promo code. It's updated. I've been telling you a different promo code. It's now, they've updated it recently. So update your promo code, save yourself some money. Locked on 15 is the promo code you want to save some money. That's Locked on 15 to save 15% at Built.com. All right. Let's keep it rolling. Best and worst case scenarios for Anfernee Simons. This is an important caveat here. The best case and worst case scenarios are within reason and without injuries. What I mean by that is we won't talk about MVPs unless it's reasonable for someone to win MVP. Everyone's best case scenario is the best player in the league, but we're doing these within reason and without injury. The worst case scenarios are things that happen on the court. We're not talking about people's bodies breaking down. Within reason and without injury, the best case scenario for Anfernee Simons is that nobody, when discussing the Portland Trail Blazers, is lamenting the departure of CJ McCollum. It is more footnote than headline, because Anfernee Simons has jumped into that role, seized that role, and if not surpassed it, at least lived up to its production quickly and effectively. He doesn't have to be CJ McCollum dancing and taking 19-footers and all of the things that make CJ. He needs to be Anfernee Simons. But the production, north of 20 a game and hovering around 4 assists, it's got to be there, because the best case scenario is that there isn't a discussion. Oh, they missed CJ. Oh, well, since the departure of CJ McCollum and since the broke up the backcourt, nobody's talking about the broken up backcourt. The best case scenario is that Anfernee Simons hushes that talk because the new Blazers backcourt is so darn special. The best case scenario for Anfernee Simons is that he's much closer to his final 27 games than he was his first 29. It's going to be a little bit different, and I discussed this leading up to this segment. He's going to play minutes next to Damian Lillard. He's going to play minutes as probably primarily a shooting guard, and then there's a chance that his secondary minutes are also split off the ball with a combination of Josh Hart and Justice Winslow, Josh Hart specifically. The role will be a little bit different. but the production, and because of the availability of shots, like there's shots to be taken in this offense with this roster and Ant's role in it as their starting shooting guard, that he can push up towards that production that he had the final 30 games when he was averaging 24 and 6, and he was just great, and he was scoring 30 points 7 times in 29 games, like a quarter of his nights he went out there and got 30 for him. Like, he was that good. The best case scenario, yes, the best case scenario for Anfernee Simons involves showing up in that midseason showcase. I'm talking about the All-Star game. The best case scenario for Anfernee Simons, there is a real peak. There is a real peak where the absolute best case scenario for Anfernee Simons is that he is an All-Star. How he gets there is so much related to the team. There is no calculation that involves Anfernee Simons just like statting his way onto the All-Star team. The Blazers get a second All-Star. They get Anfernee Simons in the All-Star game if they're one of the 4 best teams in the Western Conference. Like, that's how good they have to be. His production will be there if they're one of the 4 best teams in the Western Conference. It won't be. It's not like Ant's going to average 14 and 3 and they're going to be a top 4 team in the West. If Ant is really good, he's in the All-Star game. I think a more reasonable way to say this, like, that's the best case scenario, and I want to be clear. There is a path for him to be that good, albeit unlikely. But the best case scenario, maybe in a more reasonable, is that he's in the All-Star conversation. The best case scenario is that when we get to January and February, when you're making this list of, it's so hard to make the All-Star team in the West, that Anfernee Simons is on that list. Anfernee Simons is among the names you say when you say, it's difficult, it's challenging, it's all of these things, because you have to include Ant, because you have to include, Anfernee Simons, you have to include Anthony Edwards, you have to include, all of these other guards in the West. Colin Sexton, sure, why not? Like De'Aaron Fox, the sort of that tier of guards that are clearly good but haven't made the leap into the All-Star fraternity. The best case scenario is that Anfernee Simons is absolutely squarely and without question within that conversation, and you can't do anything about it. And if Ant is there, the best case scenario is that Anfernee Simons is an MIP. He's the most improved player in the NBA. He could have taken it, like he deserved to be part of the conversation last year. Like, he wasn't. He just didn't have the longevity, and because the Blazers chose to shut him down over the final 20 games, I think he would have been right there, because he would have had like a 40-game stretch, like a full half the season where he was averaging 23 and 5, and it would have been like, oh yeah, this dude's nuts. I think that stretch hurts his case to make MIP a little bit, because he ended up averaging 17 and 4, which means that if he averages like 22 and 5, it doesn't look as like a big of a jump, but you will know the production. If he is the second best offensive player on a team that's darn good, like if the Blazers end up darn good, 4-5 in the West, yeah, he's going to be in that conversation. I think Anfernee Simons can have an awesome year and not end up MIP. It's a weird award. It's an award for guys who, it used to be an award for guys who like make their first All-Star game and were like late career bloomers like Hedo Turkoglu. It has become an award for Giannis Antetokounmpo and Ja Morant, like a young guy who makes a leap into the MVP conversation but isn't quite MVP good. The award has changed. It has changed the way it's given out. I don't think Ant can jump into the MVP conversation. I don't think that's within realistic this year by any means. So the MIP stuff is just an odd thing, but there is a best case scenario. The best case scenario for Anfernee Simons includes All-Star conversation and MIP consideration, because he's ready to make that leap offensively. That's the best case scenario. So what's the worst case scenario? The other side of this coin is that his defensive limitations slow the depth of his impact or limit the depth of his impact. It's that Anfernee Simons, who by some advanced measurements has been one of the worst defenders in the league over the last 3 seasons, just has never been a positive defender in the NBA. He came in super young. He played spot minutes. Like, he basically didn't play as a rookie. He played like 19 spot minute games and then every single minute of the last game of the season. And then he's had, increasingly backup roles. So these defensive metrics typically, some of them capture, I don't really like defensive rating as a defensive metric, but like real adjusted plus minus, which accounts for who's on the court with you, even suggests that Simons is or regularized adjusted plus minus RAPM. It adjusts for who's on the court with you, and even by those metrics, Ant ranks very poorly defensively. He was young. It's hard to guard. It's hard to guard guards in the NBA. It's hard to be a good defender when you're young. There's so few players, particularly smaller guys, who are good then. There's just so much to process, so much coming at you, so many decisions you have to make on and off the ball. Like it takes time for guys to make strides. Anfernee Simons can become a better defender. But to be clear, he has not been one in the league. And the worst case scenario is he continues to be a minus on defense, which mutes some of his offensive brilliance. It doesn't make him a worse offensive player. It just means that there's a trade-off because he's scoring 30 but giving up 21. There is a balance to there is a level you can get to where you are so good on offense that the trade-off doesn't matter as much, but there is a worst-case scenario where Ant doesn't reach that level on offense and his defense still remains a hindrance to what he can be and what his ceiling is, and thus what the Blazers' ceiling is, because if the backcourt struggles so much on defense, that's the worst-case scenario, that they just can't get over the hump and be one of the truly competitive teams. The other worst-case scenario, or among the other worst-case scenarios for Anfernee Simons, is that his off-ball reps, because he doesn't have the ball as much, reduces his potency. He was so freaking good as a pick-and-roll guy and a lead guard and someone with the ball in his hands. His off-ball numbers suggest that he's one of the best catch-and-shoot shooters in the league. But you can't... There is a world where the worst case scenario exists where that is true, that he's a good catch and shoot player, but his potency is reduced because he is given more off-ball reps because the Blazers want to prioritize Damian Lillard on the ball. They want to prioritize some Josh Hart on the ball. They want to run stuff through Nurk. Their second unit includes Justice Winslow, who can handle a little bit like that. Like they need touches for Jeremy Grant where Ant has his on-ball opportunities reduced enough that his just general potency is a little bit reduced on offense, still a negative on defense. This is what we're talking in the worst case scenario. The other worst case scenario is that Anfernee Simons doesn't make the leap as a driver and a rim pressure guy, and his free throw rate stays relatively low. Simons can shoot it. He's also an incredible athlete. He improved a great deal as a driver last year and as a playmaker on the drive last year, but he still was not a great at getting to the rim, and he was only decent at finishing around the rim once he got there. Getting all the way to the cup was a problem for him. And he's never been a high free throw rate guy. He's always been someone who doesn't get to the line very often. The worst case scenario is that he doesn't take a leap there, and that you combine all of these things. A little bit of... the defense doesn't get there. He has less time on the ball, and with less time on the ball, he continues to be a really low free throw guy. He becomes less potent. The worst case scenario for Anfernee Simons is relatively narrow. I don't think there's a scenario where he bottoms out and averages 12 a game, right? I think the worst case scenario for Ant is he averages 17 and he shoots 39% from three. But the best case scenario is so much higher. It's 22 plus. It's 5 dimes. It's all-star consideration. It's MIP talk. The difference for Ant being his worst case scenario just means that he is a productive offense only guard. And his best case scenario means that his defense jumps up to slightly below average or slightly above average even, and that he maintains his level of positive impact on offense, and he's an absolute force. The best case scenario is that he wipes away your memory of CJ McCollum, and the worst case scenario is that there's so much mention of the backcourt that was. Those are the two scenarios for Ant. What I believe when I'm doing this exercise, what I'm trying to give you is the poles, right? The far end of the scenario and the high end of the scenario. Everyone is meant to, the way we do these best and worst case scenarios is to fall in the middle. And that's what I want to talk about to close the show. What's the realistic role and expectations for Ant? Where in the middle of this best case and worst case scenario is he likely to land? That's what we'll do in the third segment. Join me there, won't you? Still a pass first point guard. I'm still Mike Richmond. You are still listening to Locked On Blazers. We're talking Anfernee Simons season preview, and we want to close the show, or I'm going to close the show. Talking realistic role and expectations for Ant, where he fits between that best case and worst case scenario, where the pendulum is likely to go. In general, I think he's going to swing towards his best case scenario because I think he's 23 years old and improving, right? 23 years old and improving. Getting better. and took a big jump last year. The question is, can he take another big jump and sustain that for 82 games playing this new role? And the role matters. He's going to start at shooting guard, and in theory, he is going to be the number 2 option on offense. But because of the addition of Jeremy Grant and the team's plans to get Josh Hart some on-ball opportunities, it seems unlikely that Simons will push too far north of 20 points per game. 20 a game seems very reasonable. I would say 21-4 seems totally doable. But there is probably not a 25 a game, 25-7 opportunity there for Ant. Not even skill-wise, just opportunity. If Jeremy Grant is going to be part of this team, he's going to have a relatively sizable role on offense. And as long as Josh Hart is here, the way that they've talked about using him is, he could conceivably start at small forward, although I don't think he will, but I think he could close a ton of games at small forward very often. That's another ball handler on the court. If Josh Hart is the 6-man type, they've talked about giving him some primary ball handling duties on the second unit. That takes Ant off the ball a little bit too. So a reasonable role is that starting shooting guard. It's your second leading scorer. It's someone who can really shoot it. But my concern, not even concern, my hope is that Anfernee Simons still gets a ton of opportunities to run pick and rolls and be the lead guard. The Blazers, under a different coaching staff and different rosters, showed that you can have 2 ball-dominant guards and be an elite offense that doesn't move the ball very much. And I think there's some aesthetics that Blazer fans don't appreciate about that, and there is a limit to a, your turn, my turn, pick and roll, ISO-heavy offense without a lot of variety. There's a limit to where it can go in the playoffs. There's a limit to its ceiling against elite defenses, against the best defense in the league. Absolutely. But there's also some truth to letting players do what they do best is how you maximize them, particularly in the regular season. The trick for coaching is to find a balance between saying, you know what, this dude is an incredible pick and roll player. Damian Lillard is an incredible pick and roll player. We need both Anfernee Simons and Damian Lillard to run a bunch of pick and rolls because that's the way we're most potent. And we need to move the ball a little bit more. We need more off-ball movement with players. We need more creativity. The challenge is to find both. But my hope is that Simons doesn't reduce the number of pick and rolls he runs too drastically. He's going to run fewer than he did in the January to March stretch where he was fantastic just because of the nature and reality of the roster. But please don't run too few because Anfernee Simons was great as a pick and roll player. He was in the 88th percentile in terms of points per possession in pick and roll according to NBA Advanced Stats, scoring on the same efficiency as Donovan Mitchell. And on a points per possession basis, out of pick and rolls, Anfernee Simons was more efficient than Trae Young, than Chris Paul, than Kyrie Irving. We're talking the elite of the elite guards. Among high-volume guards, elite of the elite. He's Don and Trae and Kyrie are some of the best offensive guards in the league. Chris Paul's, one of the best pick and roll players in the history of the sport. And Anfernee Simons was on par with them in terms of his production. Please don't limit his expectations. Or limit his ceiling. My expectations are please don't limit what Ant can do. Because if Ant is relegated to an off-ball role, if Ant is relegated to an off-ball role, also on that second unit, if you give Josh Hart primary ball handling duties, I understand he'll get some opportunities on Ant will in pick and rolls. I get it. I know how basketball works. It's not like if you play shooting guard, you never get a chance to run a pick and roll. But I don't want it to be reduced down to 4, 5, 6 attempts a game. I want him to run 15. I want him to run so many because he's so darn good at it. There is a need for balance with this because you got a lot of mouths to feed. I think this is one of the hard parts about this roster is that Ant and Dame are going to be, in my mind, in my vision, pretty heavy usage offensive players, right? Because that's what they do best, and you want to maximize what they do best. But you got to find touches for Jeremy Grant. You got to find touches for Nurk. You got to weave in some Nazir Little stuff. You got to figure out how Josh Hart fits. You got to figure out how Gary Payton fits. And then you've got other guys on the bench who want to play. If you're trying to find minutes for Shaedon Sharpe, he's probably a guy who needs to be included as an offensive, not focal point by any means, but you probably don't just park him in the corner either. There is a balance to be struck here. And my expectations is that Ant will have not the usage that he had, the massive usage that he had, when he's pushing up 25% of used possessions in that January to March stretch, but much lower than that. Like any lower than 20% is a nightmare for Ant. Like it's really bad news for him. He's got to still tick up in that low 20s, right? He's got to still tick up and be a high usage guy and run and do what he does with a high usage guy. Run pick and rolls, attack, shoot, pull up and sidestep threes. He's so darn good at it. I expect Ant to be a 20-4 guy. Like I just think that's my expectations are that he hits those marks, not even without too much trouble, but like because of the minutes load and the responsibility, 20-4 seems totally reasonable for Ant. I expect some big scoring nights when he gets hot because he can shoot it. One of the best shooters in the league, on ball, off ball, whatever. Pull up shooter, spot up shooter, Ant can get it to the rim. But I want him to continue to be that lead guard, point guardy stuff because that's what made him so special. And my concern for him is that just the nature of the roster reduces those opportunities. So give Ant a chance because that's how he takes that step. If you don't let him maximize what he does on offense, you do not celebrate his gifts and you do not put him in a position to hit his best case scenario marks. The roster might dictate something a little bit different, but the challenge of this team is getting the most out of what your players do. And if you don't maximize a player's strengths, his weaknesses become even more glaring. We got more of these season previews coming up. We're going to do 3 next week, so come back and listen. These are evergreen. You can listen to them all leading up to the opening game of the season. We're going to run these through training camp and into early preseason by the time we finish up the entire roster. So if you're listening back to this, there's now a whole bunch. If you're listening to this as it comes out, there are more coming soon. It's a good way to kind of get prepped for the season, a little capsule of what happened with players. And I think it's helpful when we revisit them at the end of the year. It was like, what did we think that Anfernee Simons was going to do and how close did we get? It's a way to keep myself accountable with some version of predictions. That is going to do it for today's show. Come back and listen to us. We'll have more shows next week, 3 more coming at you. Tell your friends about this podcast. I appreciate you listening. I'll talk to you soon.